If you are an anti-Zionist, shouldn't you want Israeli Jews to do things like
leave their country?
Say, like leave Israel, say, okay, I have a choice between the Mossad and selling challah in London. I'm going to sell that challah in London. And you think, okay, isn't that the anti-Zionist? Hi, I'm Phoebe Maltz Bovy, opinion editor of the Canadian Jewish News, and you're listening to The Jewish Angle. Today we're going to talk about what it means to center Israel or to decenter Israel. This is a question that has been at the center of all manner of recent Jewish debates. Some of the discourse in question has been thoughtful and interesting. Some of it has been somewhat far to the other end of the spectrum. So I am, on that note, delighted to have the most thoughtful writer on this topic back, I should say, not just here, but back on the show. Josh Yunis, welcome back to The Jewish Angle.
Thank you, Phoebe. I'm so glad to be back. Friend of the pod now.
You are. You get to be friend of the pod. That is the highest honor known to humanity. It's like there's the Order of Canada, then there's friend of the pod. And frankly, friend of the pod is more impressive. So you have a wonderful Substack called The Diaspora. Given its name, it seems like you would be, one to go to on these topics regardless. But specifically, I wanted to talk about a great piece you had there called On Collective Jewish Guilt, How the Anti-Zionist Left Traded Democracy for Coercion. We're going to talk about your piece. We're also going to talk about a few things that I know you've read from things you posted and that I have also read and have thoughts about. Some of these documents that I have found less enlightening, but also that fit in with the themes that you discuss. So you, in your piece, you write, can I quote you?
Yes, absolutely.
Thank you. You write, the most effective way to undermine the sort of the Zionist argument is to make the case for pluralism, I'm really doing great today. Egalitarianism, solidarity, and democracy, to make the case to Jews that they are not mere guests of the non-Jewish majority, but its peers, that they are not in diaspora, but at home, end quote. So what you're writing about, just for context, is that like at a time when there's a lot of right-wing, populist, nativist xenophobia everywhere, right? The obvious place that could be sort of countering that would be the left.
That's right. Yeah, exactly.
And has that how it's played out?
It certainly hasn't felt that way for me, and I think for probably most Jewish people, including Jews who see themselves as on the left. And so it's very dispiriting because, as I write in the piece, that's sort of the xenophobia that's on the rise across the world. That's sort of like the easy pitch for Zionism, right? Like it's sort of the, Israel as plan B or as, the last resort for Jews, because this rising international xenophobic right reminds Jews of their very recent history and experience as people who had to flee right-wing authoritarianism and fascism and were rejected by the world and had nowhere else to go. So when we see a xenophobic right on the rise, Jewish precarity becomes kind of at the top of everyone's minds. And so the only way to respond to that is to make the case for Jews and do the work of making sure Jews know that they belong wherever they are throughout the diaspora. And that's not really what the anti-Zionist left has done at all. And so I think it's very dispiriting, to say the least.
So there's a part of your piece that I've read and reread and thought about a lot. And it's where you write, I'm quoting, when was the last time you saw a self-identified anti-Zionist show up at a vandalized kosher restaurant to help clean up its windows, broken in the name of a free Palestine, or clean the swastika graffiti off the wall of a synagogue? end quote. So I've been thinking about this a lot because it's like, yeah. But I'm thinking, I feel like there's a place that you don't quite go in the piece. And I don't know whether it's that, and I think the piece is great. And I think your argument is sound in all of this, but I'm not sure whether it's that it's not something you think, or it's just not something you're trying to do in the piece, which is that, like, why? The why. And to me, it seems not to be a downer. It seems like the obvious why is that this anti-Semitism, to give a very, it's that people who hate Jews and are looking for excuses to do these things. And that's just the why. But is there more to it? Like, is there something else going on that's either more complicated or a more generous interpretation?
Well, I'll try to give the more generous interpretation.
Okay.
I mean, I mean, that is the obvious answer, right? I think it's maybe important to try to distinguish between the people who are breaking the windows and the people who are not showing up to clean up the windows.
Sure.
And I mean, my hope and my goal, I guess, some Jewish people might call me naive or too idealistic. I mean, the hope is that I can convince people to actually change their minds and start showing up. And part of the reason that I feel it's so important to change their minds is because if I don't, or if we don't, we're in a really bad place. And Jews Jews want to be protected, right? So they're going to do something about it. And if the left is not going to protect them, with so-called safety through solidarity, which hasn't happened, Jews will find other ways to protect themselves. Either they will hire private security guards or run to whoever the king is to protect them. And I would prefer not to have that be the outcome. And I'm hoping to preserve this kind of unique place that Jews had, at least in the United States, where it really didn't feel like we were in diaspora. It felt like Jews were like emancipated in the United States, where we were not only safe, but we could express our Judaism and our Jewish identity however we pleased without preconditions. So I'm kind of holding out hope against hope there. I will say that I think when a lot of people see their, progressive colleagues or friends not showing up, it certainly doesn't leave you with a really great outlook on the future, or think too highly of people who speak in the name of social justice. And just, it seems like they just can't be bothered to kind of do both. Like, they only have time to post or to show up for one thing or the other, and they've made their choice. And that's really hard. And I guess part of why I write is to try to change those people's minds, and get them to show up.
Well, that is optimistic. So here's something that's neither, well, I guess it's a bit of a bummer, but it's also just sort of complicating categories, right? Because you could say there's Israel, there's that which could perhaps be called the diaspora, but then you have the phenomenon of Israelis in the United States, where you are, in Canada, where I am, in various places that are not Israel, who are, they're Jewish and they're Israeli and they're not living in Israel, and they may have no plans to return to Israel. Sometimes they do things like open bakeries. The reason I bring up bakeries is because something that I've covered a bit at the CJN have been these various controversies, one more recently in London and then a little bit further back in New York, where bakeries with varying degrees of like Israeli American or Israeli British ownership, got basically like BDS'd in a sense, like this, they become. Yeah. If you are an anti-Zionist, shouldn't you want Israeli Jews to do things like
leave their country,
say, like leave Israel, say, okay, I have a choice between the Mossad and selling a challah in London. I'm going to sell that challah in London. And you think, okay, isn't that the anti-Zionist thing? But somehow that's not how it plays out. And I feel like there's a message in how this plays out, possibly.
Yeah. And it seems like that would be the anti-Zionist dream, would be for Israelis to keep leaving their country and move elsewhere. And then when they show up elsewhere, it seems like they're harassed and hounded in the cities that they choose to live in, seemingly for the crime of still identifying as an Israeli person. And that's really the kind of incoherence of this, is that, this constant demand that Jews have to disentangle themselves from Israel or from Zionism. For many Jews in the world, Israel and Judaism are linked together. Their Jewishness and Israel is linked together. That's just a fact of history at this point, because we don't live in 1920 anymore. And so Jews found their way to Israel. Maybe they stayed there, maybe they left. All of us have intertwined histories with Israel. Israeli people exist, like the ones you're talking about, who might have lived in Israel and now are expats who live elsewhere in London or Toronto or Los Angeles. So then the question becomes, well, how fully do they have to disentangle themselves, not just from Israeli policy, but from the essence, the concept of Israel itself, and who gets to decide when they've disentangled themselves sufficiently? It seems like the people who want to decide that are the same people who are graffitiing their businesses and holding them, guilty until proven innocent on these questions. It's just incoherent. It makes no sense. Israel is a fact of Jewish existence, which isn't to say that we need to support all of its policies. It doesn't even mean to say that being an anti-Zionist means you're an anti-Semite, but it does mean that it's very difficult to just easily disentangle the two. And the idea that Jews have to do that in order to be protected is just a form of shakedown politics. It's just a form of coercion. It's just bigotry. I mean, that's what, making presumptions about people's political beliefs based on the ethnic or religious or national affiliation they have is the definition of bigotry.
I mean, it seems like, to me, I interpret it as kind of a definition of Zionism that is like existing while Jewish, with like, if you are existing while Israeli, all the more so. And it seems like it does make it harder to to do all sorts of things, among them criticize Israel. You know what I mean? Like, that also becomes more complicated if you are unhappy with something Israel's doing, but you don't want to make your allies be the people who are, mad at a bakery for, selling challah or whatever.
That's right. And that's something I wrote about in the piece. But, this kind of like confusion or despair that you see certain leftists and Jewish leftists have about why aren't Jews speaking out more? And maybe a part of it has something to do with the fact that Jews don't like the idea of having to walk around with the presumption of guilt or association with the policies of Benjamin Netanyahu and Itamar Ben-Gvir. They see themselves as equals among their peers, and they refuse to make their identity not in my name, or walking around saying not guilty, because that is not a way that you interact with peers in a democracy. That's the way you interact with people who you need protection from in a shakedown racket. And I think most Jews have too much self-respect to kind of take on that political identity for themselves. Speaking for myself, if I'm having a conversation in private with someone in good faith, and I know it's in good faith, I will of course tell them, Benjamin Netanyahu doesn't speak for me, and I'm horrified by what he's doing. But I refuse to make that the basis of my political identity. And I think there's a great risk for Jews in doing that, in getting sorted into good Jews and bad Jews. And on the question of the ambiguity of the term Zionism, I mean, it's been discussed ad nauseum at this point.
Oh, no. This is the first podcast to take that on ever.
But as we all know, it's at this point, it's a fairly useless term. I mean, Zionism was a project that happened and succeeded. Israel exists. And so the term is used because it gets to redefine the acceptability of Jewish self-definition, and it's imposed on us by outsiders. So if you rephrase Zionism to mean Israeli person, or person who feels a connection to Israel, or even just person who doesn't accept the maximalist one-state solution position, then all of a sudden that becomes much clearer, and the kind of vilification of Zionists, or the demand that Jews disentangle themselves from Zionism, becomes much clearer as some kind of form of intolerance, at least, or a liberalism that we shouldn't accept, I think.
So there's something that I wanted to, that I think builds on this, which is this whole question of centering Israel or not centering Israel, because that isn't the same as, like, it's a whole different axis than like criticizing or praising, right? Because there are anti-Zionists who absolutely center Israel like no one's business, and there are people who are nominally Zionists doing the opposite, rather, I should say. Well, certainly doing the same, but also doing the opposite, like people who, if you prompted them, would say, oh yeah, Israel's a Jewish state, that's great. And then they couldn't care less about Israel and are thinking about other stuff all the time. But there has been this real, just call it a trend, seems dismissive, but a shift towards this real glorification of the decentering, right? So I'm thinking specifically of like Max Strasser's rave review in the New York Times of Molly Crabapple's History of the Bund, which I'm sure I'm not German, I'm mispronouncing. But I'm also thinking of, there was this WHYY, like Philadelphia Public Radio, I guess, website piece about, or may have been originally radio, but regardless, about Yiddish learners in Philadelphia, a city I'm familiar with. And there's one whose last name, interestingly, is Rabin. So I hadn't even noticed how I had posted about this earlier, who's 32, a performing artist and therapist. And there's a quote from her that I just found really interesting, and I'm going to read it. She said to the journalist, I grew up thinking that Israel was my culture and my lineage. That's how American Jewish institutions teach it. And it's just not true, she said. My family is not from Israel, Palestine. My culture is Eastern European Yiddish, end quote. So I found this super interesting, and I posted about it. I'm guilty. I posted. And I'm going to write more about it too. But like, it's just, I thought about this because that's my heritage as well, right? Why do I feel something different than this person does? Now, the very, very easy answer is we are from different, like, whatever worlds. Like, I think this is somebody who, like, we're probably not going to connect on a lot of things, but like, at the same time, we have the same general background. Probably, if prompted, she would also pick the Democrat over the Republican. We're not from totally different planets, right? And I was thinking that, like, there is this sense in which it is just chance if your family, if you have that kind of background, ended up in North America, say, versus Israel, right? And specifically, if your family was there for the worst of it, the chances were far greater they would have ended up in Israel. And there's just something about this that just gets under my skin.
Yeah.
Help me with this. Be my performing artist and therapist in this matter.
I've been thinking of so much about this too, and I should write about it. But
you should.
I think what gets under my skin and your skin about it is that in it, all of this kind of Bund fetishizing and this, this kind of reclaiming of a Jewish identity independent of Israel when Israel exists, in the United States at least. I think it says more about kind of the tensions and contradictions that are happening on the American left right now than anything about Jews and Zionism. Because, post 2020s, there's in the present day on the left, it's a left that kind of shuns assimilation and is very pessimistic about the American national project. So if you think about what really made Jews who didn't move to Israel safe, it's the ones who were lucky enough to get on a boat and come to the U.S. and got here before 1924, when immigration laws were passed that barred Eastern European Jews from coming anymore. And their assimilation into the United States. And part of that process of assimilation was into, I guess, what we would now call, quote unquote, whiteness, which is, seen as a sin on the contemporary social justice left. And so by reclaiming the Bund and kind of this Eastern European culture of last century, what these folks get to do is they get to kind of wash their hands of the sin of their assimilation into of their ancestors' assimilation into whiteness. They get to reclaim Jewish identity in a movement that shuns assimilation. And at the same time, they pin all the blame of settler colonialism on all of the things of the engine of American culture that gave them their actual safety, and place it on the very Jews who were excluded from that and who ended up in Israel. So it's kind of this like, adds insult to injury. It's like our ancestors, like my mother's parents were Holocaust survivors. And to think about, first they were excluded from American prosperity at the time. And now in the present generation, those same people who were excluded from it become the fall guys for the sin of settler colonialism and assimilation. And it's this kind of like very perverse, rubbing the wounds in for the Jews who've been excluded from that process. And there's something very grotesque about it that I find, which isn't to say that Jews have to be Zionists or drape themselves in Israeli flags, but they do need to have kind of the self-awareness and humility to know that it was a matter of luck that makes them American and not Israeli. And so the question of how do you reclaim a Jewish identity in an age when Israel exists is a question that the Bund can't answer. If Jewish solidarity and Jewish identity is a category of meaning that is important to you, and it doesn't have to be. You can just be an assimilated person whose parents or grandparents were Jewish, and it doesn't matter to you anymore, and now you're just a white person in New York. But if you want to reclaim that identity, you have to think about Jewish solidarity with Jews who are elsewhere in the world, especially the ones who were excluded from America and mainly ended up in Israel.
Oh boy, I have so many thoughts about this. I also was going to make a joke that I realized wouldn't have worked because there is a video clip components, because I was going to claim that I'm sitting here draped in Israeli flags and that you wouldn't know because it's audio, but you might be seeing a clip of this in which you will realize that I am in fact wearing a giant cape of a keffiyeh. No, I am wearing just ordinary clothing. It's actually very boring. But I was going to say, though, I was thinking like being an elder millennial, I remember very well the 2010s and the endless discussions about Jews' whiteness, are Jews, and I took part in these discussions. It was always very interesting, sort of, Jews and white privilege, all of this, on and on and on. And I feel like there was this weird way at the time where I felt like some of the insistence from progressive Jews, like of atoning for their white privilege, felt like in this weird roundabout way, a way of claiming whiteness. You know what I mean? Like saying, I'm so sorry for my white privilege. And then like, if you post that to Twitter and you're Jewish, good luck. You will hear from the people who don't think you're white. You know what I mean? Yeah. Like that is immediately, and that was even the case in 2016. Like that's not actually as new as all that. But I was thinking also about just something with this sort of valorous, the celebration of the sort of working class past, specifically something that came up in Molly Crabapple's Guardian piece that was like associated, whatever, I don't know if it's a book excerpt or just sort of inspired by the whatever that was about. It was about New York Mayor Mamdani and people who were criticizing him, where she has some line about ritzy Upper East Side synagogues or something. And it just seemed like there is this element where it also seems like there's a socioeconomic, I don't even know what it is. I don't know whether to categorize it as like cosplaying working class or that these are genuinely like precarious, like people in arts and journalism type areas. And, I'm in a arts and journalism type area myself. I get it. But like who are sort of like, I don't know. There's something interesting going on. And I feel like it's very hard to categorize because it seems like it's both identifying. I think the main thing, okay, maybe I'm maybe what gets under my skin is that it just seems like it's cosplaying something, and it doesn't seem to be like addressing head on the world in which we actually live. Is that it? Maybe.
Yeah, I mean, it does seem like a big LARP for one thing. I mean, the other thing is like, uh, yeah, I mean, it certainly doesn't speak to many of the material interests of American Jews. I think Noah Millman wrote about this on Substack. You know, there is Jewish working class history is still alive, but in Israel, I would say that the contours of that are much sharper. Um, and I think also, you know, for all the talk about how it's not about Israel, Israel remains the frame of reference for these people. It's all shaped in opposition to Israel. You know, the goal is not indifference to Israel. It's shaped in opposition to Zionism, not even to Israel, but to Zionism. Which, again, going back to that, they're relitigating an intra-Jewish dispute that happened 100 years ago, and then another 100 years of history happened. And so there's it's just not a very very meaningful argument to Jews who are alive today, and they think that like if they trot out like the one Max Nordau quote, they'll like, you know, win some imaginary fight they're having with like Eve Barlow and stop antisemitism.com. It's like so weird. It's like Israel exists, and it's a very live, living place, you know, despite all of the problems it has, and it's a deeply dysfunctional place with so many problems. It's, you know, Jewish people and Jewish nationhood is alive there, whether or not they like it. It goes on, and it's going on without them. Even as they sell books about the Bund, mainly seemingly to their non-Jewish audience members who want to hear about the good Jews and not the bad ones.
Yeah. So there are many things I could still bring up. In fact, there were two, but I'm going to bring up the one that I think is maybe more in keeping with what we've been talking about. So there was a Jewish Currents article about how if you're Jewish, you should hate yourself, which I think we can just like agree that if you're Jewish, you don't have to hate yourself, or you can hate yourself for any number of reasons, but it doesn't have to be that you're Jewish. You know, it can just be human self-loathing. It doesn't
so
have
many
to
good
be
reasons to hate yourself. Yeah.
You know, there's always a reason. But we're going to talk just our final few moments about this piece in Jewish Currents that I really resisted clicking on for a while because I knew I was going to get a little mad online, but called "When Jewishness Means Genocide." Philosopher Elad Lapidot discusses how our understanding of anti-Semitism changes in an era in which Jews and Zionism have been conflated, with Ariel Angel and Daniel May. Quote, "Now, if someone found out, for example, that your grandfather was Jewish and starts calling you out on Gaza, that seems akin to racism, because it really has nothing to do with you. But if you identify as Jewish and are doing things in the world as a Jew in a moment when Jewishness is being used to enact genocide, then you cannot say it's anti-Semitic or racist to associate you with it, because you're associating yourself with it." End quote. Okay, so again, listeners, that ain't me. I'm quoting somebody. Sometimes this can be an issue with podcasts, I have learned. But anyway, Josh, what do you make of this?
I mean, it's so amazing to me how, and it's not lost on me that the people mainly who seem to be doing this are Jews themselves. I think most normal people find this to be a little crazy, and it mainly just comes from kind of the Jewish Currents left and maybe some really extreme intolerant and illiberal streams of the Palestine solidarity movement. And they're just reinventing new ways to call bigotry social justice every day. I mean, making presumptions again about what people believe based on the actions of someone else who they share the same ethnic or religious affiliation with is the definition of bigotry, number one. Number two, you know, they've been prattling on about how Zionism and Judaism and Jewishness need to be disentangled for years and years. And if the message is still not coming through to the people who are harassing Jews for their association with Israel, the question to ask yourself is, why has the message not gotten through, right? Why do they keep making this association? Why do they keep doing the racism, the bigotry? And the movement doesn't even ask themselves that question. They don't even think that it's a question for them worth answering, which itself is evidence that they're not actually serious about the issue of disentangling them or of solving the problem of the association of Jews and Zionism to end this bigotry. And I think what this really gets at is that across the Jewish political spectrum, there's really very little interest in actually disentangling Jews from Israel or Zionism, including from Jewish currents, even though they proclaim they want to do it all the time. What you see in that piece is actually they've sort of given up on that. And they're just saying, actually, you know what, they are entangled and there's nothing to do about it. And if you get harassed for it or violently targeted for it, there's nothing to be done. And I think what that gets at is that actually we need to rethink the associate, that there are certain ways in which Judaism and Jews and Israel are very hard to detach from one another. And that would actually require the left and people who speak in the name of Palestine to rethink some of their language. But it seems like what Jewish currents wants is kind of just this original sin and eternal damnation for Jews, so that there is no way out of it. If you say, I'm separating myself from Israel, they'll ask you, well, why are you still doing Jewish things? And so the only way to be absolved of the sin is to proclaim that the inseverability of Jews and Israel. And so it's just this Kafka trap. It's just this loop where there's nothing you can do to be saved from damnation. And I think obviously most Jews think that that's absurd and insane. And so then you have to ask yourself, really, who is this for? Because it's not for Jews, because it doesn't persuade Jews. And I think who it's really for is just people looking for an excuse to call their hatred social justice, and I think that's what this is about, mainly.
Yeah, I think I was just thinking as you were talking that there's been so much discussion of don't say the expression self-hating Jew. Don't say self-hating Jew. And this is literally an argument that if you are Jewish, you should hate yourself for that, which is just fun. It's funny to read that. Not funny, but huh.
I do, yeah. And I do want to, I think I've been thinking about that too. I think, a lot of Jews will they call them pick me Jews or something, which I feel is kind of actually a little bit reductive and doesn't really fully capture what's going on here, because what they're saying there is actually not pick me as in to save me. They're actually saying don't pick all of us. We're all collectively guilty, including the Jewish currents people. And we're all sinners, and we should all be harassed and targeted for this. So it's kind of this vision of it's kind of like a masochistic vision or a vision of, self-annihilation. I don't actually, maybe they're saying, go for the other ones first, but eventually we deserve it when you come for us too. Yeah.
Well,
I think it's fascinating. Yeah. It's so fascinating to me. And I'm just endlessly fascinated, by this.
Oh, no, go on.
I've seen, it just mirrors what I've seen among certain friends or family watching how they reacted to Trump 10 years ago. And to be a Jew back then who thought that Trump would enable anti-Semitism and was bad and dangerous for us, and to see the cognitive dissonance at work among Trump supporting right-wing Jews because he was good for Israel or whatever. I feel like I'm watching the same movie again, but on the left. Just people who, I think Jewish people who maybe somewhere deep down in a place that hasn't been brought to consciousness, have some hankering for suffering. American Jews especially, I think. And my theory
Canadian
would be
Jews are completely different.
Yeah. I do think there's a kind of just sense of guilt about why did we have it so good as American Jews and we don't deserve to. And so it's this kind of wish fulfillment for something worse to happen. That's how I'm doing some armchair psychoanalysis.
No, that's interesting. And I almost wonder, and we do not have time to get into this in full, nor do I feel qualified, whether that's why you see less of this maybe in England or France than you do in particularly the States, but also I would say in Canada.
Yeah. The French seem to do a better job of kind of holding two thoughts at once, the French Jewish community, from what I've seen.
Yes. Well, for another time, we will tackle France. But until then, Josh, Yunis, thank you so much for coming.
Thank you so much, Phoebe. This was
on
great.
The Jewish Angle. Come back anytime.
Great. I will. Okay.